Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Strengths in Numbers, Insights and Strategies on How to Weather the COVID Storm in Community Colleges. With nearly 100% of schools turning to some, excuse me, hold on just a second, my script disappeared. Dang Zoom. With nearly 100% of schools turning to some form of e-learning amidst COVID, how are community college administrators responding in order to provide uninterrupted quality learning experiences for their students? In this webinar, we identify the core factors that stall the adoption of EdTech solutions in community colleges. We discuss the current inefficiencies in the way the EdTech marketplace partners with community colleges and discuss a collaborative and data-driven approach to better understand their students' needs and identify appropriate vendors and evaluate the impact of EdTech products on their student success. We highlight key insights gathered from the College Innovation Network, which consists of a number of member institutions aligned in their commitment and focus of making student-centered and data-informed EdTech investments. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to go over a few items. You can please type your questions in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end. You can also discuss our fun little question, coffee, if you prefer coffee or tea. And you can connect with us using the hashtags MCCA webinar. We will be sending a recording of this webinar to those that registered today. Myself, in case you're wondering, I did type mine in, but I like both coffee and tea. I just finished my coffee and I believe that Bobby is drinking tea as we sit here. So now for today's speaker. Again, he was with us last week, so hopefully you are as well. Dr. Omid Fatouhi, Director of Learning Innovation with WGU Labs and Learning Research and Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh. I do want to give a little information about WGU Labs because they're a great partner of ours. WGU Labs invents, builds, and invests in learning solutions that are both innovative and effective with the aim to improve outcomes for learners everywhere. Dr. Fatouhi is a research psychologist exploring and researching the processes and scientific mechanisms underlying human motivation and performance, with the goal of empowering individuals to achieve their full potential. He is a research associate at the Learning Research and Development Center based at the University of Pittsburgh and the director for learning innovation at WGU Labs. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Waterloo, after which he worked at Stanford University, where he co-founded the College Transition Collaborative, one of the largest multi-institution collaborations to deliver proven psychological interventions to over 40,000 students, as well as the Stanford Interventions Lab, a collaborative research group committed to sharing and scaling proven insights from psychology to promote better performance and well-being. He has led 45 professional development workshops across the United States to help students, faculty, leaders, athletes, and corporations better understand the psychology of success and equip those groups with the tools they need to perform at their full potential. And now he's with us. So I will now hand it over to Dr. Fatouhi.
Great, thank you for that warm introduction and thank you all for being here today. I will, while trying to learn how to share my screen, give you, so it looks like I'm not able to share because of some restrictions on my sharing.
We'll get that fixed for you right now.
So while we wait for the sharing rights to be granted, I wanted to share with you a little bit about my own background in that I am a social psychologist by training. And after completing my postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford, I quickly got pulled into this domain of consulting with post-secondary institutions to help them better understand how to develop and evaluate some of the innovative strategies and solutions that they were thinking about creating for their students with the aim of improving student outcomes. And as I got more and more involved in this space, my typical engagements or partnerships with these schools would consist of long days of boardroom meetings with the leadership, huddled around, trying to figure out how to grapple some of these core issues, usually in a similar pattern of exploration. And from time to time, as we're all sitting in these boardroom meetings, I would have someone in the leadership raise their head, look me square in the eyes and say, Omid, with your insights into psychology and your experiences working with all these institutions around these common issues, can you tell us what we need to do to better serve our students? And of course, being in the room, everybody else directly starts to gaze at me. So all eyes on me. There's a pause of a moment of silence in the room, with the expectation that I be able to come up with some solution that solves all the problems. And after a moment's pause, I turn back and I usually respond by saying, I'm flattered that you think that I have the solutions for what you're looking for. But I wonder, have you bothered to ask your students what they need and ask your students what their experiences are like? Have you tried to engage them in these conversations and these processes? And when I say that, there's usually another moment of silence, this one a little bit more awkward because that's not what they were expecting. But it is surprising at times when you iterate just how plainly apparent such a strategy is. I think especially in times of critical decision making, when there's a lot at stake, when we care about improving our students, that we forget the processes that are optimal for making effective decisions. And that usually means more engagement. That usually means more data points. It usually means more connection and more dynamic responses to students' evolving needs. So that's what I hope to lay out for you in the presentation today, as well as giving you a case study of how we at WGRE Labs have tried to identify the core barriers that prevents decision makers like yourselves from engaging and employing these most effective strategies. And so with the support of WGRE Labs, be able to enhance and facilitate that decision-making process that is data-informed and most likely to be effective. So let me see if I can share my screen now. There we go. Thank you so much for resolving that. So COVID hit and the world was thrown into disarray. What's interesting about a crisis or an immediate and very vivid moment of threat, whether real or imagined, is that it activates our threat response. From a psychological perspective, it's the flight or fight response. And most often it's the flight response. That means that when there is imminent threat that we don't feel capable of addressing, our response is to isolate and distance ourselves. In fact, this was a strategy that was mandated and required by many of our local and federal agencies. The result was this separation of individuals. Now, this seems pretty plain. When we put this fact in the context of decision making, hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. Because as I alluded to earlier, effective decision making is one process that entirely depends on the utility and the accuracy of the data points that you have. And when you're expected to make these decisions in isolation, necessarily what you're doing is you're distancing yourself from those data points, potentially putting yourself at risk for making errors in judgments. What is clear to many of us, especially in light of the recent and rapid changes of how we think about education, but also learning, is that there seems to be this unifying theme of technology. That technology is the agent that connects education to students for their learning needs. In fact, when you look at the rates of some form of e-learning adoption shortly after COVID, you see that pretty much 100% of post-secondary institutions that traditionally had not offered entirely e-learning platforms were now gravitating to some form of e-learning as a mechanism for reaching their students. Excuse me. And with this rapid change, many of us as administrators and decision makers are now again faced with more uncertainty. Not only is there the uncertainty of how students will respond to this health pandemic, but also how are we going to better equip our students with the technological needs that they need to be effective in their learning. And so in times of uncertainty, there are some common reactions that occur. And COVID in particular has really changed the rules with regards to how we think about what we do. More than ever, it's clear that no one person, no one administrator, no one leader has all of the answers or any of the answers really. That all of us are also faced with not only trying to give our students what they need, while at the same time being forced to make some significant cuts to our operating budgets. And so making that decision around what do I keep and what do I give up in this time of uncertainty raises the stakes further, which again potentially heightens the possibility of making decisions by mistake. And again, the informed decision maker who maybe traditionally would have relied on historical data to make predictions about what to expect in the coming months and years is now realizing that the historical data that they've relied on traditionally is no longer valid, that pattern of students' responses and student engagement as informed from historical data is quickly changing. In fact, we're faced with many surprises, one of which, for instance, is that many colleges, not all, but most, are surprised at the consistency of enrollment patterns among their student populations. You might have predicted that with the freedom to learn anywhere, that many students would have chosen to enroll in different institutions. But that hasn't been the case. In fact, most students are continuing to apply and enroll in the schools that they had intended to, and the schools that are relatively local, which in the time of remote learning doesn't seem like it makes all sense. The question is, will that pattern persist, right? As remote learning becomes the new standard, can we expect shifts in enrollment that might look different than what we're looking at today? Now, I lay up all of these factors to highlight a core human psychological experience, which explains to us how people behave in times of uncertainty. And I hope that you'll realize that we are all prone to these kinds of tendencies. What I'm showing you here is a graph of the percentage of the populations of various countries who are willing to donate their organs in the event of a fatal accident. And a quick scan of this graph might leave you pondering why the stark difference between some countries and others. Some possibilities could be something to do with their core values, what they prioritize, culturally what's informed to these individuals about what is right or what is wrong, religion. Any of those factors might come to mind as a possibility for these stark differences in the percentage of people who donate their organs. But interestingly enough, when you actually try to unroot the cause of these differences, it turns out that it has nothing or very little to do with individual differences and almost everything to do with the way that the information is provided. And specifically, how the information is provided is when you go to decide whether to donate your organs, it's during the moment that you're typically renewing or applying for your driver's license. And at the back, there's a box that says, do you, some question related to organ donation. Now, typically, what you'll find is, do you choose to, if you choose to donate your organs, please check here. And when the question is framed with that language, check here if you choose to donate, what you find is that those are the countries highlighted in the left, in the yellow bars, with relatively low percentage of individuals who choose to donate their organs. Whereas when the question is framed as follows, check here if you do not want to donate your organs, that's when you see these really high levels of willingness to donate organs. Now, the question is why? Well, it turns out that it has to do with in moments of uncertainty, when you're about to make an important a decision that is important, and you don't have all of the information, the default ends up being inaction. The default ends up being a deferral of that decision until you have more data. You think to yourself, this is clearly an important decision. I'm not ready to make this decision right now. I don't have all the information. So what I'll do is I'll delay this decision until later. And because of that psychological experience, that in moments of high importance and some level of uncertainty, that our default is inaction, maybe helps us to shed light and help us to reflect around how have we been engaging and navigating some important decisions that have been forced our way. And so hopefully that gives you a good background, a psychological context for why and how to think about these processes. And I'll lay out, as I mentioned, some strategies and recommendations, as well as a case study that helps to target these issues, helping administrators and leaders like yourself make more data-informed decisions. Now, interestingly enough, when there was a large survey of administrators at community colleges asking them what they wanted from EdTech, from technology, back in 2019, the top factors that administrators were looking for included that they wanted tools that were designed for specifically community colleges, that they wanted better tools for remote learners, that they wanted tools that helped and support to help them navigate and understand what is out there in terms of the options of EdTech, that they also wanted some support with how to implement existing EdTech solutions into their existing infrastructures on their campuses. And more, again, support with the transition, installation and implementation of how that EdTech is operating once it is introduced to your campus. Now, you might look at this list and think, this is very strikingly similar to what we are all thinking about in terms of our EdTech decisions. Now, I remind you that this was done back in 2019, before COVID hit. And the reason why I highlight that is because these same factors, these same barriers, have been at the heart of why administrators have not taken action to employ and introduce more EdTech on their campuses, even before COVID. The fact that these factors are even more salient and more powerful now, I think might even allude to the possibility that there might be more inaction from administrators when it comes to some of the innovation that's necessary to really keep up. I think surely and certainly most of us realize that we need to provide some form of remote learning platform for our students, and giving them access to Zoom seems like the natural default option. But what's going to happen when students are zoomed out is how I call it. Once they've been exposed to so much, I would say, distance interaction with their learning through this filtered approach of a Zoom screen, when they start to demonstrate disengagement, when they start to demonstrate decrements in their learning, how do we respond? And I think recognizing that we need to be a step ahead of the innovation in order to anticipate what students' needs are, so that we don't get to a point where, again, we have to react to what is absolutely necessary, is my hope with what we can talk about today. I will say, as was highlighted earlier, if you have any comments or questions, I'm happy to discuss them as they come up. I'll just ask the moderators to maybe interrupt me and sort of scan those comments as they do come into the chat. But this is meant to be a time for you all, and if you have questions that you would like me to address, I'm happy to in real time if you think it's relevant and important. So what I want to do now is share with you some of the outlines of a project that I'm happy to be leading with WG Labs and some of the folks there, including Lisa Ferrara, called the College Innovation Network. Now, the College Innovation Network is a project that was proposed in light of the concerns that we heard from that large survey of administrators. It was specifically attuned to how can we position ourselves to support administrators like yourself to make the decisions in a timely, responsive, and data-informed way. I'll again remind you that this project was proposed before COVID. The fact that COVID happened only accentuated and accelerated the need for these kinds of services. So let me go through what the College Innovation Network is. Essentially, this was a proposal to create a network of member institutions who could work together towards a common goal of identifying their students' evolving EdTech needs, and then implement a systematic process that helps them integrate that into their existing platforms, but as well as ensuring that there is an impact through an evaluation process. In essence, we wanted to create a small group of individuals at WG Labs that acted as concierges, if you will, to work with the administrators to lighten the burden of EdTech sourcing, implementation, and evaluation. Now, the evaluation component is something that I think is critical. Oftentimes, when you look at the EdTech marketplace and how partnerships are formed between vendors and institutions, it's done in a slightly haphazardly way. This is despite the fact that oftentimes these engagements can be quite costly. That administrators will say, hey, we think we need this product, or a vendor will reach out to them and say, hey, we have this product, let us do a demo. There'll be some conversations, and after some form of back and forth, there will be a decision to move forward. Once there is that dotted line that is signed, there is a financial investment that ties these two partners in groups together as partners, and then the EdTech solution is implemented. Now, as I mentioned, oftentimes these are costly decisions, and once implemented, there is a tendency for the institutions to want to play it out, potentially at times, not always, at times for longer than they need to. They might have inklings that the EdTech product that they've partnered with is not serving the needs that they had envisioned, but they persist a little bit longer in the hopes that what they've invested currently will yield some sort of return. And what that leads to is really sort of a partnership that stales and becomes inefficient for both parties, because there's dissatisfaction from the member institutions and there's a lack of impact that is expected, but that is not delivered. And so this notion of evaluation, although seemingly apparent, and often vendors will say that we will provide to you some metrics of impact, it's often done through this sort of biased channel of the vendor saying that we will provide you with reporting. And thinking about evaluation again from a psychological, from a science perspective, we realize that it's critically important that you have this objective third party that facilitates that component for you. And whether you have that in place within your institution, some organizations have this, the IR department that helps to facilitate that, or you work with a group of institutions to have that facilitated. I would encourage you to think about that critically as you're contemplating some of the various vendor options that are coming your way. So as I've mentioned, I think what the WG Labs recognized was this need to help member institutions to organize them and connect them together within a network. And I'll share with you how we've done that. And also to provide support with sourcing and evaluating of the vendor providers. The benefits to institutions for being part of the College Innovation Network during this initial inaugural pilot phase is because this is a funded project. There's no fee associated with the services that labs provide, as well as no fee associated with the early EdTech that's implemented and evaluated on their campuses. As I mentioned, WG Labs will take ownership in sourcing the products to make sure that there is a good representation of the vendors available that address a specific need. That labs will also assist with the implementation support, that we will connect a network of individuals and institutions through a partnership and through several convenings. And that hopefully this partnership in this network will reflect positively on their campus and their community as being part of an innovative approach that is proactive rather than reactive. In terms of the ideal networks that we reached out to, we wanted to really ensure that the efforts and the investments that we have had access to are channels to institutions that are in most need and stand to benefit the most from these services. So we were intentional in reaching out to broad access policy, admissions policy institutions that really do make it a priority to serve underserved and underprivileged groups of individuals. That we employ a structure where decision-making is not driven by our group at labs, but that is a collective and collaborative process that's driven by the member institutions. And that there be this, again, this priority and commitment to evaluating, but also to sharing out the insights that are gathered through this collaborative effort. In our first year, which we started a few short months ago, we already have 6 member institutions: Rio Salado, Central Ohio Technical, Loyola University, Piedmont Community College, and 2 campuses from the PASHE system in Pennsylvania, the California University and Mansfield University, who are part of the inaugural members of the College Innovation Network. And again, what we think the College Innovation Network offers is that it empowers institutions to better serve their students by rigorously testing products that have a demonstrated impact on student outcomes, and to be part of this continuous improvement process where we uncover highlights so that products and solutions can best be targeted towards those needs. And that all of these efforts are facilitated through the resources and supports that we at WG Labs hope to offer. In terms of the goals of the College Innovation Network, they would broadly fall under 3 categories. First is to connect mission-aligned network members, not only with labs, but with each other. That we facilitate convenings where we bring together institution administrators from each of the institutions, where we engage in this collaborative problem exploration and potentially allow for strategy sharing and insights sharing between members of the network. The second is the needs assessment. Unfortunately, it is more uncommon than common that institutions know what their students' needs are. And that's because A, it's always evolving, and B, it's a very labor-intensive process that can require almost its own department to be able to stay on top of. And because it's constantly changing, it's hard to keep up with that rapid approach to understanding the needs of the students. Also, being able to gauge what your needs are in the context of the needs of other institutions. We may have a pretty clear sense of what we need, but by understanding what our colleagues, our collaborators, our partner institutions in neighboring areas are also contending with, we might miss something that they have been grappling with, or we might have too narrow a perspective that doesn't take in the broader set of potential problems that as a collective we're tackling. And the third goal is really to help with the implementation support. So at labs, that we have a really well staffed group of engineers that assist with the IT capacity, with the implementation, and as well as some expert social scientists that help with the design and the evaluation of any product that's implemented. And basically how that process looks like is that there is this sort of stream where we support the sourcing of innovations through looking at existing startups, nonprofits, and researchers, bring them together into this college innovation network where they all collaborate and interact with the intent of sharing out insights that are relevant to each campus, a select source of vendors that can address those identified needs, but also sharing out with the broader community what those needs and those strategies are. The timeline for this project, as you'll see, is multi-leveled. We've established the College Innovation Network. We've already engaged in this deep dive of the needs assessment of partner institutions, which culminated in a convening that we facilitated a few short weeks ago. And now we're about to embark on the research and design process that does a deeper dive into the potential for novel products and solutions, as well as the beginnings of starting to source and vet existing vendors that match the needs that we've identified so far. So what have we uncovered so far? After many conversations with the partner institutions, their constituents, as well as the convening through a collaborative discussion, we wanted to be able to capture as many priority areas that were relevant to member institutions in a matrix that highlighted not only the ones that are of high priority, but also the ones that are of high urgency. And as you'll see, there actually are a fair number of priorities that are relevant to campuses in the College Innovation Network. But being able to focus on the most urgent is something that we thought would be of value to this collaborative. And so through that process, we identified 4 key domains that were top of their urgency and importance that we could address with the potential of EdTech solutions. The first was access and equity, ensuring that all students have equal access to learning opportunities by minimizing the digital divide. Flexible solutions for students with a focus on mitigating inequitable access among underrepresented and underserved student populations. That was a core theme that resonated in almost every conversation we had. And recognizing that that in itself is a distinct project and a distinct category was something that we highlighted as being a commonly shared priority for the schools. The second was student engagement. As we have now transitioned to remote learning, how do we keep students engaged with each other and with their learning environment? Well, by understanding how we can facilitate meaningful interactions between individual learners, as well as the learners with faculty, as they face the realities of remote teaching adjustments, we hope to seek ways to create greater engagement in collaborative learning or peer learning contexts. As I mentioned, what we're seeing now is this Zoom fatigue or this zoomed out phenomenon that students are starting to feel the forces that they relied on traditionally when they went into the classroom that compelled them to pay attention are starting to wane. And so how do we keep them engaged? Again, relying on a single platform that merely provides access to the content in a static and flat way may not serve us in terms of how we adapt to students' needs next year and the years to come. So thinking about that and exploring the vendor marketplace for solutions and innovations that address those needs is the second priority that was highlighted. The third was faculty readiness for remote teaching. Right? Just as much as we're realizing our students are not ready for this abrupt transition to remote learning, so too are the faculty, who again, traditionally may have had a very set way of doing what they've done, but now are forced to dramatically change and add to their workload in terms of how they deliver and how they think about their learning content to students, offering assistance and guidance to faculty, many of whom are not trained or feel confident in remote teaching modifications accelerated by the COVID pandemic, is that third area of priority that we've highlighted. The fourth has to do with early alerts, recognizing that students are no longer in person. Therefore, we may miss some of the cues that we've relied on in the past to identify students who might be falling into an at-risk potential experience. how do we capture, identify, preempt the needs of students in a way that can best support those individuals as they go through this journey? Establishing and strengthening mechanisms to translate student data into actionable, timely insights to faculty, student services staff, and administrators. We hope to identify students with the greatest needs, allowing prompt and relevant intervention. This was a core theme that, again, resonated with all of the administrators that we've been working with. I imagine some of these will also be themes that resonate with you. I will also mention a question that came up, which was, what if in the time of COVID and this rapid and transformational series of changes, we feel like there is no existing product or vendor that can meet our students' changing needs? Well, we heard that as well. And in fact, what we wanted to do is to see if we could lay into place a process that helps us identify students' need with the potential of creating a de novo or a novel product that is not on the market. So at Labs, bringing together the set of expertise to not only identify the core needs and help with the implementation and evaluation, but potentially help to co-develop with your institutions a product that is most tailored to your students' needs in the time of COVID. So we heard that, and that's exactly what we're planning on doing. Through relatively rigorous LXD, learner experience and learner-driven design, we have in Labs a set of designers who are really attuned to working with constituents on campuses that includes support staff, faculty, and importantly with students, to understand what they're going through, to hear from them through their voice what their needs are and how they feel, whether they are or not supported, as well as trying to capture what their experiences are with either existing or potential EdTech products. What is it that makes for an effective and engaging interaction for students, so that when a new product is designed, it captures all of those parameters. This process is also part of a new strategy that is complementing what we're doing for this collaborative project. What you're probably hearing is that there's a bit of dynamic responsiveness that we're employing. We certainly had an initial vision for what we wanted to do with the College Innovation Network. But as we began to work with the institutions and hearing of the evolving needs, we also responded in kind, so that we positioned ourselves to serve those needs. And what I hope to do is to maybe share some of those broad level strategies with you. I can't undermine one last component that we've again been listening to, and this is something that I hope that you all are also paying attention to, which has to do with the data and the potential for insights that data holds. One of the themes that we heard overarching all of the main priorities was, how do we make data-informed decisions? And again, as I mentioned in my anecdote with my previous consulting experiences, my response is that you look at your data. Your data is there. We live at a time where it's inescapable that there is massive amounts of data captured. What I hope to encourage you to do is not to rely on long and historical data that precedes COVID, but rather to think about this novel pack of data that's coming in since the time of COVID as its own distinct data set. That set of data can be the basis for insights that differentiate what your strategy and investments could be compared to what you've traditionally looked at in the past. And that maybe you can actually even merge those insights to understand both the likelihood of long-term needs, but also the responsive needs that students have currently. At Labs, what we've tried to do with the College Innovation Network is to provide some of these data analytics and visualization services to early stage members. Now, we're doing this carefully and thoughtfully, partnering with only one or two member institutions, but we've heard what the needs are, and we're trying to make sure that this data analytics support is something that we offer institutions. We're also encouraging all institutions like yours to really think about what are the departments in-house that you have that you could bring together and engage with to find out how you can better utilize and leverage the data that you have. So I do want to maybe just sort of round off the hour and the presentation with some broad recommendations that are informed both through the experiences that we've gathered through the College Innovation Network, but also from a psychological perspective and research of how we can make more effective decisions. In isolation, you're not likely to make the most informed decisions. And as you're thinking about these difficult decisions, I would encourage you to collaborate with the various departments on your campus, but also those institutions that are in your neighboring areas, that you try to reach out to them and say, what are you doing and what are you struggling with and grappling with? Can we maybe carve out some time just to touch base and see if there are commonalities or areas of divergence that are worth taking note? Again, I make this recommendation recognizing that there's a huge amount of scarcity on your bandwidth and your resources, but compared to the competition, if you want to continue to thrive past COVID, it is these small incremental investments that everyone is struggling to make. But if you are able to carve out that bit of investment, that hopefully that will give you the competitive edge to stay ahead of the competition. I would also encourage you to empower your groups within your campus to take some ownership, to take that notion of innovation to heart and run with it, that they be granted the power and the opportunity to take problem statements and see if they can generate solutions and partner with existing networks of individuals on your campus to tackle those specific strategies, those specific problems, and then come back to you and reconvene and reflect on what the insights and the challenges and the solutions are. By empowering your network to reach out to their networks, what you're able to do is you're able to impact changes that span way beyond what you would expect if you were the only one making those decisions. And so with that comes a bit of, I think, appetite for experimentation, for things that maybe don't pan out initially, but that hopefully will sort of self-select in terms of the ones that do show impact and the ones that don't. The ones that don't will fizzle out on their own. And that's part of this process. It doesn't mean that you've made a mistake, but by casting a wide net of individuals and champions for what's happening, that those individuals will gather insights that are much more difficult to do if you rely on more of a flat hierarchical structure for your organization. The third recommendation is to lean in on tech. Now, had you asked me this question a year ago, I'm not sure that I would have stood by it as strongly as I do. But given all of the many difficult choices that we have in terms of what financial cuts or elements we need to retain, I would say more than anything, consistent across all of the institutions we've worked with, technology seems to be the one consistent resource that will hopefully yield the return on investment that will extend beyond this current crisis. And that hopefully the technology that you invest in is not solely to help you respond to the immediate needs of your students, but that will also be investments that will anticipate what your students' evolving needs are. So experimenting with some innovation that goes beyond just your basic urgent needs, but that to invest a little bit more into that technology with the hopes that one of those or a handful of those will really address your students' needs beyond this current time that we're going through. And as I've mentioned, data analytics, you have the most powerful resource within your grasp. How you manage and organize and synthesize and analyze that data is where the work comes. But if you have the capacity, invest in that now. Invest in cross-functional teams that can come together and give you the perspectives and insights into what your data represents and captures. I won't belabor that more than I already have, but I don't want that to be an undermining of the importance of data as we're trying to make predictions of what our students need and what we can anticipate in the years to come. And finally, go big. I know that in times of uncertainty, in times of critical importance, the tendency tends to be inaction. But it is specifically at times like this that bold strategies and innovations have the greatest potential for impact. That in order to set yourself up for what's coming down the pipeline, that it is the fundamental changes that you put into place now that will help you thrive into the future. With that, I do want to pause here. I want to allocate the rest of the time to any questions or comments that you may have. I also welcome you all to reach out to me and my team. If you have an interest or curiosity about what the College Innovation Network is, I've mentioned that we have completed the first cohort, but we are opening up membership to a second cohort of both educational institutions and now to EdTech vendors. With the intention that we can facilitate those partnerships. So if you have interest in learning more about that, reach out to me or to Lisa, and we'd be happy to orient you around the resources that are useful. But with that, I think I'll pause and see if there are any questions that I can address. I'm happy to share with you the process or the insights that we've captured through the College Innovation Network, or any insights that hopefully the field of psychology can bring to these challenging times.
Yes, I want to remind everyone you can type your questions in through the chat or the Q&A box. And I do believe, hold on just a second, I think we have one. Trying to navigate all of the communications I have going on, and this Q&A box keeps getting in my way. What does EdTech look like in the US versus countries around the world heavily impacted by COVID as well?
So that's a really great question. And I think what that question highlights to me is just the lack of clarity, even of what EdTech is, how it's represented by the marketplace, and then how we can find the products and solutions that meet our needs. And as you're alluding to, both the availability of the vendors and the needs will vary region by region. I think I can speak to some of the common needs that we're seeing emerge in the US, which I think are pretty well represented through the insights gathered that we captured through the College Innovation Network needs assessment process, which do revolve around equity and access. How do we make sure that we can connect students to the learning opportunities, given the very, very fair reality that there will be inequitable access? Some of the schools that we've worked with at a very early stage said that when COVID first hit, EdTech was not about buying a software or hardware that our students needed. The EdTech solution that was needed was to set up hotspots in parking lots because their students did not have access to broadband Wi-Fi. And so you found these large abandoned parking lots that were now populated with students sitting in their cars, working on their laptops, because the need was that they just needed access to broadband. And so as we think about EdTech, I think it's this nebulous term. And my hope is that when we think about EdTech that's relevant to us, we inform that decision based on what our understanding of our students' needs are. I think beyond that, really the sky's the limits. We're at a really exciting time. One thing that I will mention, which might be surprising to most, is that the pace of EdTech growth on the marketplace has actually not shifted that much in the past year compared to the rate of growth that we've seen in the past 5 years. Now, given COVID, you might think that's surprising because everyone's had to transition to some form of e-learning or EdTech innovation. But the recognition that EdTech is increasingly an important and vital part of the student learning experience is something that has been on the rise for the past 5 years quite significantly. What's really become apparent is the need for technology to directly connect students to their learning experiences now. And what I'm hoping that I can leave with you or submit to you for your consideration is that even those existing platforms that we use to connect students are changing dramatically quickly. This experience of feeling Zoom fatigue, it's becoming quite prevalent. And so how do we create learning experiences that are not only connecting students, but engaging students? I think that's the next evolution of what students' needs are. And again, these will vary by region and by campus. And so as you're thinking about these regional distinctions, I really would encourage you to think about what are the needs of your students on your campus so that you can then try to explore what solutions are out there.
And this kind of goes along with where you were going there, but what do you see as the future of disruption in terms of a hybrid or blended learning model in higher ed after COVID?
Yeah, one of our colleagues on the College Innovation Network posted an op-ed in the Evolution titled "Try Not to Waste a Good Crisis." And essentially what this crisis has allowed us to do, it's certainly challenged us in many critical ways, but it's really also given us the opportunity to see what are the critical elements of an effective learning experience. When MOOCs first came on stage, there was a huge sentiment that this would entirely disrupt educational institutions as we know it. It never took off, really to the extent that we expected it to. And that understanding of why that there were limitations to purely an online interaction for learning had insights that were really useful. And again, we're seeing some similar themes emerge. That students, for many instances, rely on the physical campus for some of the very many benefits that we may have taken for granted up until COVID. That students rely on campuses to provide a safe, distraction-free, resource-rich environment where they can go and deeply immerse themselves in their learning experience. As a student, if you go into class at a scheduled time, you might know and realize that there is that notion of accountability, that your teacher expects you to be there, that your peers are looking indirectly for you to be there, and that there is this implicit agreement that everyone's paying attention to the teacher. This distraction is discouraged through the forces of the norms that we've created through the social, physical experience. With remote learning, those forces are no longer there. And so what does that mean in terms of distraction? What does that mean in terms of focus? Those are big questions that we're grappling with now. There's also benefits, right? Because now if you're a person who not even have considered going to college or having some sort of educational experience because you're having to deal with the demands of feeding your children and your family, you're having to work part-time, but now that everything is remote, you can actually fit that into your schedule a little bit better, that you can take the classes that were traditionally only offered during daytime in the evenings when you come home. So it's actually increasing access for many, but it's, there's also negatives in that it's causing some friction and points of detachment for many as well. And so I think in terms of disruption, what I'm most excited by is this moment of silence that COVID has provided us, where we can deeply reflect on what are the core elements of an effective learning experience that we can either retain or discard. If we don't need structured times for learning experiences, maybe we can build in more flexibility even as we transition back to in-person teaching. If we're going to continue to offer remote learning, what are the ways that we can enhance that notion of engagement? What are the ways that we can support students to have a distraction-free learning environment so that they don't have the rest of their family in the background waiting to use that single computer in the household that's positioned on the dining room table? These are considerations that are real, that we can now start to think about. And so disruption, I hope, comes with a moment of pause and reflection, and isolating the elements that are core to a truly meaningful learning experience, that potentially move away from some of the traditional models. Do we really need a 4-year degree? Can we build in some flexibility in terms of what accreditation looks like? Can we create more customization, more personalization? I think these are the big questions that are top of mind for many educational philosophers as well as social scientists.
Great, thank you. We have another one. How do we use technology tools responsibly so we do not create more technology addiction?
Right, and I think that is a wonderful question. And I hoped that I would really highlight the critical importance of evaluation to address that very same point. I think as we create a systemized process of gauging the return on investment, the impact of a particular EdTech product on the outcomes that we in advance identify as being a priority for us, then we can make that informed decision about what is it that we want to keep, what is it that we want to not keep. In terms of the broader sort of social and cultural impact that COVID has caused us to reflect on, specifically around, are we now becoming more reliant on our screens? I think that is a fundamentally important question. And I think it's going to be a difficult one for us to navigate, especially as right now the default channel is to give more technology with the hope that that creates the same learning experiences. I will say there are some small set of developments that are showing some promise. I think this concept of learning pods, which has really gained a lot of popularity, especially with the younger ages, the K-12 context, where smaller groups of individuals are coming together voluntarily to have a facilitated learning environment. We're seeing much more flexibility and innovation in terms of how we think about lab space. How do we facilitate those kinds of learning experiences when we don't have access to the traditional campus resources that we've had? As the previous question highlighted, we're facing a moment of pause where we can isolate the components that potentially disrupt how we do learning. And the hope there is we're able to zero in on those core elements so that we keep the ones that are effective and maybe lean away or become cautious to the ones that are there by default or by dependence. So I really appreciate that question because I think it should be a driving priority for the decision-making process that is part of the evaluation component that I think is critical.
My kids are in a pod, and luckily they're not at my house this week. They were last week. And I do appreciate the pod to go with that question because it gives them a socialization that they would get at school that they wouldn't get if we were working by ourselves, if they were schooling at home by themselves like they were last semester. So they have recess with other kids. Other kids can help them. So it does get them off technology during those breaks to where they're not just playing Fortnite during recess time or break time. So, and we do have one more question. Do you view the ongoing exposure and use of technology in the classroom to have a negative impact on performance? And how do we balance this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's probably, again, more questions than answers, but there are little bits of data from social psychology and learning science that maybe help us answer that question. I think, there are a lot of benefits to technology. There's the possibility of interacting with your content in a way that you couldn't if you're just sitting there listening to a teacher. It provides greater access. The flexibility is something that you require if you need to, learn at different hours or in locations that are not on campus. But there certainly are challenges as well. If you are looking at a screen and in the background, there's, your Instagram and Facebook popping up, or even just the availability of those distractions, that actually detracts from your learning, right? And so how do we isolate and potentially block off those forms of distraction? There's the fatigue that comes from looking at a screen too much. So again, how do we find balance to create an engaging learning experience that bounces between the interactive and potentially the tech-informed or the tech-driven experiences? So I appreciate that kind of thinking and that kind of questioning, right? I think as we are now face to face with this behemoth of technology as the single channel of our learning, we're asking some pretty critical questions. And my hope is that we don't stop doing that. We sort of take technology, EdTech, to a higher level of scrutiny, because if we're going to rely on it, we need to make sure that it's serving us in a data-informed and responsible way. So I just want to highlight how much I value questions of that caliber, because it's essential as we start to engage in greater EdTech adoption for our learning experiences.
Thank you. And thank you for those great questions.